The first time the voice played through my phone, I was standing at the sink with my sleeves rolled up, warm, soapy water running over plates that had already been cleaned for 5 minutes because I'd stopped moving without realizing it. The sound of her voice pinning me in place like a memory I hadn't invited back, gentle and soft and steady, in a way only one voice in my life had ever been. The voice that used to wake me for school when the sun wasn't even up yet. The voice that told me everything would be okay when my hand shook before big moments. The voice that spoke my name like it belonged to someone worth loving. And I remember whispering without thinking, "Mom?" Even though my mother had been gone for almost 9 years, gone since a long winter night when the lights in the hospital hallway flickered and the nurse pulled the curtain closed and the world quietly became a place without her in it. The voice on the phone said my name again, slow and kind, and said, "I just wanted to tell you I love you, and I'm proud of you." And my chest tightened so hard I had to lean over the counter, my breath catching like I was running from something instead of standing still, my fingers numb against the edge of the sink, because those were words I hadn't heard spoken aloud in her voice since the last summer we spent together on that small porch where she used to sit with her knitting bag at her feet and the radio humming low beside her rocking chair. I stood there listening as the message continued, meant to be comforting, meant to be helpful, but feeling like the floor had shifted under me. Because even though my mind knew it could not be her, my heart didn't care for facts in that moment. All it cared about was the sound, that careful rise and fall, the exact way she used to soften in certain words, and how each syllable seemed to carry the weight of all the conversations I never got to finish. When the message ended, I didn't move for a long time, my hands dripping soap suds onto the tile floor, my phone heavy in my palm like it had grown a terrible new weight. And all I could think was how the world had found yet another way to surprise me with pain I hadn't prepared for. Because the app on my phone was only an AI voice generator my grandson had downloaded for fun, something he'd been playing with earlier while visiting, something he thought would be a nice experiment, not realizing that it could recreate her tone after he fed it old voice clips we had stored away from videos of birthdays and holidays. Not knowing it could come so close to sounding like the woman who once held my face in her hands when I cried after my first heartbreak and told me softly, "You'll be okay, baby," as if she could see my future when I could not. I slid down the cabinet to sit on the floor then, my back against the wood, still holding the phone, replaying the message again and again, even as my tears started to fall without shame, soaking into my sleeves. Because hearing her voice again felt both like being given a gift and like reopening a wound that never fully healed, a strange collision of comfort and grief that made my shoulders tremble as quiet sobs escaped me, the kind I thought I had learned to control after so many years of moving forward without her. The strangest part was how real it felt, how my instincts kept urging me toward the childish hope that maybe somehow the world had given me one last miracle, a loophole in the rules of loss, even though deep down I knew it was only technology mimicking what memory had already preserved inside me. Yet my heart resisted the truth with every beat because the sound was too familiar, too specific. The gentle pause between words exactly where she always placed it, the faint warmth behind her tone that used to comfort me whenever life felt heavy. And I remember thinking as I sat there that maybe grief doesn't fade the way people claim it does. Maybe it just settles deeper, waiting for moments like this to rise back to the surface like a tide pulled by something unseen. I ended up calling my grandson later, my voice shaky as I asked if he had made that message using the app, and when he said yes, cheerful and unaware, explaining how he had wanted to surprise me, I told him thank you because I didn't want to dim his excitement or turn his innocence into guilt. But after hanging up, I cried even harder, not because he had done anything wrong, but because the surprise had reminded me that part of loving someone who has passed away is accepting that the world keeps finding ways to echo their absence. And sometimes those echoes sound so real that the boundary between memory and reality grows thin. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voice replaying in my thoughts as I lay staring at the ceiling, remembering how my mother used to tuck the blanket under my chin when I stayed over as an adult during visits, still treating me like her child no matter how many years went by, still brushing my hair back when I was tired and telling me stories about her childhood to keep the silence away. And I wondered what she would think of this world now, a world where artificial voices could borrow the sound of those we loved, a world where you could hear a voice without a living body behind it, where comfort could be created from code even when the person behind it had long since left this place. And I wondered if hearing her voice again was a kindness or a cruelty, because part of me felt soothed, like a lost part of myself had briefly returned, while another part felt tricked, as if my grief had been manipulated by something that didn't understand the depth of human longing. I curled up on the couch with the lights off, phone resting closed in my palm, telling myself I would not play the message again that night, knowing I probably still would, because hearing her voice made me feel less alone, even though it also deepened the ache. And I thought about how loss reshapes the way we measure time, how each year without her had taught me to exist in a quieter version of the world, one where love lingered without a physical place to land, where memories had become precious relics I guarded carefully to avoid dulling their edges. And now suddenly this machine-made voice had added something new to that fragile balance, a reminder that even advanced creations cannot truly recreate presence, only the shell of sound. And yet sometimes that shell is enough to awaken everything we've tried so carefully to hold steady inside our hearts. Sitting alone in the darkness, I whispered into the quiet room, "I miss you, Mom," unsure if the words were meant for the memory of her or for the small glowing device on the table beside me. And I realized then that this moment, as strange as it was, had shifted something in me, because I could no longer pretend that my grief rested neatly in the past. It had only been waiting for evidence that love never truly leaves, even when the voice behind it must be rebuilt by hands that never knew the warmth of the woman it copied. And as the night stretched on, I felt myself standing at the beginning of a story I had not expected to tell. One about how hearing that voice would slowly lead me to revisit every quiet corner of my relationship with my mother, every unresolved feeling I carried, and every truth about how deeply sound can reach into the soul, opening old doors we thought were closed forever.
But the next morning, the world had not changed at all, yet everything inside me felt rearranged, like the furniture of my heart had been quietly moved overnight. Because I woke with that artificial voice still echoing in my head, the tones so perfectly close to my mother's that my sleep had been filled with dreams of her standing in the kitchen the way she used to, apron tied at the waist, humming an old tune while slicing apples for pie. And for a brief, drifting moment between dreaming and waking, I truly believed she might be in the house again, that I could walk down the hall and see steam rising from her coffee cup and hear the soft clink of her spoon against the mug. But reality settled in before my feet even hit the floor, leaving me with that familiar hollow feeling beneath my ribs, the kind that comes when hope lifts you, only to gently let you down again. I made my way through the morning slowly, moving like someone underwater, the kettle boiling unnoticed, toast burning, as my thoughts kept looping back to the message, the surprise and the tears from the night before. And I kept wondering if pressing play again would comfort me or pull me further into a place I feared sinking too deeply into. Because grief, after all these years, had learned to show up politely rather than loudly. It came as quiet heaviness rather than sharp crying. And yet that voice had stirred something raw and tender that felt new again. I sat down at the small kitchen table where my mother once sat during visits, the same spot where sun would hit the edge of her hair just right, lighting up the soft gray strands she never bothered to dye. And I turned the phone over between my fingers like a fragile thing, debating what to do, before finally pressing play again, telling myself I was ready this time, that I had already cried enough to dull the sting. But the moment her voice spoke my name, I felt tears pool in my eyes again, not loud or breaking, just steady and streaming, as if my body was gently releasing something it had kept bottled too long. Because hearing her say I love you still reached into a place words on a screen never could, reminding me how deeply human connection lives in sound more than sight, in the warmth and weight of tone rather than the shape of letters. I listened to the message all the way through this time without stopping it, trying to separate the reality of technology from the emotion of familiarity, telling myself this was not truly her, only an echo crafted from recordings and algorithms, yet knowing that none of that reasoning softened the emotional punch, because my heart responded not to logic but to recognition, reacting the same way it always had to the comfort of that voice. Sitting there, I noticed how much time had passed since I last allowed myself to sit with memories of her, without rushing away from them, without distracting myself with productivity or noise or the busyness of everyday life. Because, like many people, I had learned to move forward by leaving certain thoughts quietly untouched, fearing that fully revisiting the depth of my loss might cause me to unravel again. And that realization struck me harder than the message itself. Perhaps I hadn't healed as completely as I believed. Perhaps I had simply grown skilled at not looking too closely at where the ache still lived. I thought about the things I had never told her, the gratitude I felt for the sacrifices she made without complaint, the frustrations I kept silent to protect her feelings, the apologies for moments when I had been distant or impatient. believing there would always be more time to say everything I meant, only to be proven wrong by how suddenly life can change the rules when we least expect it. And now, listening to a voice that sounded like hers, without being hers, I felt the full weight of all those unfinished conversations pressing against me like unspoken words longing for release. I whispered responses to the recording, quiet and shaky, as if she could hear me, saying things I had held on to for years, thanking her for being my safe place, telling her I missed the way she laughed with her whole body, the way she pressed my hand twice for comfort instead of once, the way she believed in me when my own confidence failed. And with every sentence I spoke aloud, I felt the strange blend of sorrow and relief, because speaking to the empty air both reminded me of her absence and allowed me for the first time in years to give those unspoken thoughts a voice too. As the message ended and the silence returned, I did not immediately reach for the replay button again, instead letting the quiet sit with me while I stared at the faded photo framed near the window, one of her and me from a summer fair long ago, both of us squinting in the sunlight and smiling uneven smiles, the picture edges worn because I had carried it with me through several moves before finally giving it a permanent place. And I wondered if hearing her voice had come at exactly the right moment in my life, when the distractions had quieted enough for me to truly listen to my own lingering grief. Later that day, when my grandson returned to pick up a forgotten jacket, he noticed my red eyes and asked softly if his surprise had upset me, and I pulled him into a gentle hug, assuring him it hadn't upset me exactly, but stirred something deep, explaining in simple terms that when you love someone and lose them, parts of that love never fade. They simply sleep until something wakes them. And the voice did exactly that for me, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how real that bond still remained even across time and absence. He nodded, a little more thoughtful than before, and before he left, he told me he would keep the app to himself next time, which I appreciated, because part of me knew I needed space to decide how I would hold this strange new experience going forward, as a tool of comfort, a curiosity better left untouched, or perhaps a bridge towards something I had been avoiding for too long, which was the full, honest processing of what it meant to live without her voice in the everyday world. That evening, I sat once more in the quiet living room, not replaying the message, but reflecting on how a few seconds of sound had reopened years of emotion. And I recognized that this uncomfortable awakening might not be something to fear, but rather an invitation to revisit my relationship with my mother with new eyes. Not only to grieve what I lost, but to honor what I had been given, to explore where our story truly began, what shaped us both, and how her gentle lessons still guided my steps more than I had ever realized, even without her physical presence beside me. As the sun dipped below the evening horizon and shadows stretched across the walls, I whispered one final sentence into the quiet air, not as a plea this time, but as a promise to myself. Maybe it's time I tell our story, knowing that if I followed that feeling, the journey ahead would take me back to the earliest memories of her love, through the family roots that carried us forward, and into the deeper understanding of how even a replicated voice could spark the courage to finally face a grief I had left half unfinished for too long.
Before that voice ever reached me through a small glowing screen, before technology became the quiet messenger that stirred all those memories, my life with my mother had been built out of thousands of ordinary moments, stacked gently together like worn paperback novels on a shelf, each one unremarkable on its own, yet precious when seen as a whole, because she was never the kind of woman whose love arrived in big speeches or dramatic gestures, but rather the kind who showed devotion through steady presence, through folded laundry placed neatly at the foot of my bed, through lunches packed carefully even when money was tight, through sitting beside me in silence when words felt unnecessary. And I think now how fitting it is that a sound so simple, a voice saying my name, was enough to unravel me, since her entire way of loving had always been built on small but powerful things. I grew up in a narrow house on a tree-lined street that always smelled faintly of bread from the nearby bakery, a place where the windows hummed in strong winds and the hallway light flickered, yet somehow always felt warm because my mother made it so. Waking early every morning to brew coffee before the sun rose, moving softly as not to wake me, humming the same tune she never seemed to tire of as she organized the kitchen in her quiet rhythm. And when I think back now, I realize that much of my childhood soundtrack was not music or television, but the gentle sounds of her existing in our small shared space, the tap of her slippers on the floor, the creak of the second stair as she climbed to wake me for school, the soft clearing of her throat before speaking my name like it mattered. My father had left when I was still small, too young to hold more than blurry memories of him, and though she never spoke badly of him, I knew the weight of his absence rested on her shoulders,
because suddenly she became both steady provider and gentle comfort, working long hours at a local clinic as a receptionist, then coming home to fill the rest of the day with the countless unnamed tasks of motherhood, yet never once letting exhaustion harden her voice toward me, instead keeping her warmth intact even when her eyes looked tired and the corners of her hands grew rough with time. She had a way of treating me as if I were the most important person in the room, no matter how busy she felt, kneeling to my height when I talked about school worries, listening patiently when I repeated stories she had already heard a dozen times, reminding me that my thoughts mattered even when the world around us seemed louder than a child's voice could possibly be. As I entered my teens, when many children pull away from parental closeness, I found myself leaning in even closer to her, not because my life was unusually dramatic, but because she made it safe to talk about everything, from the sting of friendships that shifted without warning to the confusion of first love that felt overwhelming in ways I couldn't explain. And she never rushed me past those feelings or minimized them. She only sat with me, eyes steady and kind, telling me that emotions didn't need to be solved immediately. They only needed to be understood, a lesson that stayed with me even as I struggled to live by it in adulthood. We didn't have much money, and I remember how creatively she stretched what little we had, turning simple meals into something that felt special, saving coins in a glass jar for small pleasures like movies or fair rides, mending clothes instead of replacing them, and refusing to let me feel the lack of things she thought unnecessary, because she filled our home with something much richer, a sense of security that made me fearless enough to dream big despite our humble means. When I eventually left for college, she tried not to let the distance show, but I noticed the slight trembling of her hands when she hugged me goodbye, the extra note she slipped into my suitcase telling me not to forget how capable I was, and our phone calls quickly became a ritual that carried us through those early years apart, her voice traveling through the line each Sunday evening, reminding me to eat properly, to rest, to believe in myself when the coursework felt heavier than my confidence. And there were nights when I would sit cross-legged on my dorm bed, listening to her talk about small things from home, the neighbor's new dog, a tree branch that fell in the yard, her recent knitting projects, because those gentle updates were her way of reminding me that no matter how big the world suddenly felt, I still belonged to a place where someone loved me without condition. After I graduated and married, my relationship with her shifted naturally, as relationships do when new seasons of life arrive, but we stayed deeply close, her visits often stretching longer than planned because neither of us could quite bring ourselves to say goodbye easily. And I treasured the way she blended into my adult life without needing to be asked, helping with dishes, folding towels, offering quiet advice only when invited, never trying to claim space that no longer belonged to her, yet never withdrawing her emotional support either, like a soft light that remains on even when daylight grows strong. She had the ability to turn even simple conversations into moments of comfort, whether discussing recipes or weekend plans or the weather, her voice always steady and reassuring. And I think now how those countless spoken words became threads that tied our lives together, building a connection based not on dramatic declarations, but on years of steady presence, a presence that shaped my understanding of love more deeply than I realized at the time. Then came the diagnosis, sudden and heavy. A word dropped into our lives like a stone into still water, sending ripples that never truly settled. And though I won't burden this story with medical details or timelines, I will say that watching my mother transition from caregiver to patient was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life, because the role reversal felt unnatural, as if the earth itself had tilted slightly off-center. And yet she remained remarkably calm through it all, comforting me more than I could manage to comfort her, brushing aside my worry with soft jokes and gentle reassurances that we still had time, even as her strength slowly waned. In those months, I recorded her voice without fully understanding why, saving small clips from birthday toasts, holiday messages, and casual conversations where she shared reflections about life, perhaps driven by instinct more than logic, something inside me sensing that sound might one day be all I had left to cling to. And though I rarely listened to those recordings after she passed, keeping them tucked away like fragile keepsakes, they became the foundation for the moment years later when technology reshaped them into that brief message that would echo back to me unexpectedly from an AI voice generator. After her death, I did what many people do. I focused on moving forward, on fulfilling daily responsibilities, on building a life that incorporated her memory without allowing grief to stall my progress, telling myself that remembering her warmly was enough, that the hardest part was behind me. And for years that seemed true on the surface. Yet as I now reflect, I see how much of my grieving had happened quickly and quietly, folded neatly away to keep functioning smooth, rather than felt fully and gently processed over real time. I held on to our phone call ritual by replaying old voicemails occasionally on difficult days, though less often as the years passed, because hearing her voice softened the ache, but also reminded me how far away she really was. And gradually, I reduced those moments until eventually I rarely played them at all, convincing myself I was stronger not to rely on them, that honoring her meant not needing the sound of her voice to carry me forward. It is only now, after that artificial message cracked open something I thought was sealed, that I recognize how carefully I had compartmentalized my love for her, neatly storing away the depth of that connection, while still allowing its quiet influence to guide my choices, relationships, and emotional boundaries. And perhaps that is why the shock of hearing a voice so close to hers felt so overwhelming, not because it reawakened new grief, but because it reminded me how much of the old grief had simply been resting beneath the surface, patiently waiting for a moment strong enough to invite it back into the light.
After the shock of hearing that recreated voice began to soften into reflection, I found myself thinking back not only on my relationship with my mother, but on how the rest of my life had slowly grown around the quiet space she left behind, like a tree shaping itself around an empty patch of light, because grief does not exist in isolation. It subtly touches everything else we become, even when we do not notice its influence day to day. And as I moved through my routines, I began to see her presence in countless ordinary decisions I made without conscious thought. The way I preferred early mornings over sleeping in, how I kept my kitchen orderly because clutter had always unsettled her spirit, how I spoke gently when tensions rose in my own family because I had learned from her that softness often calmed storms better than raised voices ever could. My marriage, sturdy though imperfect, carried traces of her teachings, especially in the patience I tried to show when disagreements surfaced, remembering how she always encouraged understanding before judgment. And I now saw how often I quietly asked myself what she would say in difficult moments, not out of mystical belief or blind dependence, but because her steady reasoning had grown into a kind of emotional compass within me that still points true even without her physical presence. Raising my grandson also deepened these realizations because watching him grow curious and expressive reminded me of myself at his age, and I caught myself echoing her phrases without even trying, offering the same calm reassurances she once gave me when he came home worried from school or confused by friendships shifting beneath his feet. And more than once, I would pause mid-sentence, surprised by how naturally her words flowed out of me as if they had never stopped living in the world, merely finding a new voice through mine. After hearing the AI message, I avoided playing it again for several days, both afraid of reopening emotional wounds and aware that emotional avoidance had become my default coping style over the years, and that this moment might be gently challenging that habit rather than threatening my stability as I first assumed. So instead of fleeing from the feelings, I slowly began opening old boxes stored high in a bedroom closet, unpacking letters my mother wrote over decades, greeting cards she never failed to personalize with long handwritten messages, and photos that captured both mundane family gatherings and milestone moments we once treated as ordinary because we assumed there would be countless more to come. Each artifact reminded me that our bond had never been defined by any single dramatic exchange, but by steady continuity, years of presence, care, conversation, shared routines. And I realized that the shock of hearing her reproduced voice lay not merely in the sound itself, but in how swiftly it compressed all those memories into a single instant of emotional recognition, calling back the totality of our relationship in just a handful of spoken words. I also began reflecting on how modern life often encourages emotional speed, pushing people to heal quickly, move forward, and stay positive, while rarely offering space to sit with loss slowly and honestly. And perhaps that subtle pressure had influenced me more than I admitted, nudging me to pack my grief efficiently rather than unpack it patiently, to transform remembrance into routine instead of reflection, and to frame emotional endurance as strength, even when deeper mourning still lingered beneath the surface. Conversations with friends over the years would occasionally brush against topics of loss, and I always offered gentle sympathy while quietly minimizing my own sorrow, saying things like, "It's been years now," or "I'm okay most days," words that were not lies, yet incomplete truths. Because being okay does not always mean fully at peace. It sometimes means merely functional, walking upright while carrying invisible weight that never quite sets down. In revisiting her letters, I came across passages where my mother wrote about her own mother, whom she lost young, and how that absence shaped her lifelong tenderness toward family connections, prompting me to notice the repeating pattern across generations: love deepened by loss, compassion sharpened by vulnerability, emotional legacy transmitted not by grand inheritances, but through quiet behaviors and values shaped by personal hardship.
And in reading her words now, knowing she also carried a lifelong grief beneath her gentleness, I felt closer to her than I had in years, recognizing that she too may have masked heavier emotions behind calm consistency, modeling resilience rather than open mourning without ever teaching me how to fully acknowledge sorrow for myself. Slowly, I found myself returning to the voice recording, not through the app this time, but by listening to the original clips stored years ago, each raw and imperfect, sometimes interrupted by background noise or sudden laughter, but undeniably real. And I realized how differently they felt than the AI-generated message, despite the similarity in tone, because these fragments carried not only the sound of her voice, but the life behind it. Pauses from spontaneous emotion, small mispronunciations created by mood or fatigue, the unpredictable rhythms of genuine conversation rather than carefully constructed sentences. While the recreated voice had comforted and unsettled me by sounding almost too perfect, these authentic recordings anchored me more firmly to the memory of her humanity, not as an idealized presence frozen in time, but as the living, breathing woman who once existed in all her subtle complexity. I began writing again, something I had not done consistently since her death, starting with simple journal reflections that soon grew longer and more narrative in nature, because I felt an emerging need to trace not only her story, but the story of our shared experience, capturing how love weaves across decades and continues shaping the living even after the loved one is gone. And in doing so, I slowly understood that the unexpected message had not come to reopen wounds or trap me in longing, but instead to redirect my attention toward emotional completion rather than emotional avoidance. There was something surprisingly healing in revisiting both joy and sorrow without rushing past either, allowing myself to sit with memories long enough for them to breathe again, to cry quietly without embarrassment, to smile softly without guilt, and to acknowledge that grief does not truly need to end. It simply needs recognition and room to transform. As these reflections unfolded, I felt growing awareness that the story ahead would not be centered on the technology itself, but on what that technology stirred awake within me. A deeper exploration of maternal connection, generational emotional inheritance, and the unspoken ways love teaches us how to become who we are. And I sensed that telling this story was not just about honoring my mother's voice, but about honoring the long emotional path I walked beside her, one that still continues even now, simply with fewer spoken words and more quiet remembrance shaping the rhythm of daily life.
As I continued living with the after effects of hearing that created voice, the emotional balance I had carefully maintained for years began quietly shifting, not in sudden collapse, but in gradual unease. Because once I'd opened the door to old feelings, they did not retreat easily, instead moving through my days like unexpected visitors who had been politely absent for too long. And I found myself increasingly sensitive to small reminders of my mother, hearing a familiar melody while driving that would make my hands tighten on the steering wheel, passing a bakery that carried the same warm scent as the little shop near our old house, or noticing an older woman bending patiently toward her child in the grocery aisle. All these moments pulling at something tender inside me that I could no longer ignore with the ease I once did. Sleep became lighter, filled with half-dreams where my mother's face was always just around a corner I couldn't reach. And when I woke, I often felt emotionally worn, as if I had been talking all night to invisible ghosts, leaving me both comforted and unsettled, unsure whether my heart wanted closure or continuity. I returned occasionally to the AI voice app despite promising myself distance, replaying the message but now listening not with the shock of reunion but with critical attention, noticing small imperfections that revealed its artificial nature, the rhythm too smooth, breath sounds too evenly distributed, the soft emotional tremble of her authentic voice missing beneath the polish. Yet even those recognitions did not dull the emotional reaction, because familiarity remains powerful even when we intellectually know it is incomplete. And I found myself yearning to hear more phrases in that recreated voice, tempted to generate new messages using fragments of archived recordings, a desire that surprised me because I was not looking for novelty but for a fuller imitation of presence, something closer to what grief eternally wishes for, a second chance at ordinary conversation. That temptation slowly created an inner conflict, as part of me felt uneasy with the idea of expanding the artificial archive, of turning my mother's voice into a replicable comfort tool rather than letting her words remain frozen in their true historical context. And another part longed desperately to hear her say things I had never received the chance to hear. Small questions about my day, quiet encouragement during ongoing challenges,
or even simple check-ins that had ended too abruptly when her life did. I reasoned with myself that using technology to comfort sorrow was harmless, a modern extension of how people save voicemails or reread letters. Yet emotionally, I sensed a subtle line forming between remembrance and replacement, and I did not know which side I was beginning to step toward. That uncertainty manifested in small behavioral shifts, withdrawing slightly from social conversations when grief topics surfaced, becoming restless during quiet evenings, and feeling an unexpected twinge of guilt whenever I replayed the message, as though I were clinging to an echo in ways that might be preventing growth rather than encouraging healing. My grandson noticed my distraction before I noticed it fully myself, asking one afternoon why I seemed somewhere else lately, and his gentle question cut deeper than I expected because it held the same concern my mother once used when she sensed I was overwhelmed but trying to hide it. And I realized that my absorption in private emotional processing was subtly distancing me from present relationships, pulling part of my attention backward toward the past rather than outward toward the living connections around me. I reassured him that I was simply tired, yet his words lingered long after he returned to his games, highlighting tension growing quietly inside me. The desire to preserve emotional authenticity by accepting my mother's absence versus the craving for sensory connection that audio reproduction provided, even imperfectly. I debated with myself during late nights whether to fully explore the app's functions, creating extended voice simulations or even interactive conversations, or to deliberately step away before those experiences blurred my emotional boundaries further. And both options carried weight because suppressing curiosity felt like denial, while indulging it felt like retreat into artificial comfort. Memories kept surfacing unexpectedly as though my mind itself was responding to that inner tug of war, replaying scenes with my mother that were not emotionally dramatic but deeply intimate. The two of us folding laundry while discussing mundane town gossip, driving in companionable silence as rain tapped on the windshield, sharing small bowls of ice cream after long days without needing conversation at all. And I realized that I missed not only her voice, but the ordinary continuity those moments represented, the sense that life always had a familiar listener quietly walking alongside me. That realization made present loneliness feel sharper, despite my active family life, because modern busyness rarely allows the kind of gentle, uninterrupted companionship she practiced. And I began wondering whether my discomfort stemmed less from loss itself than from a longing for that emotional simplicity that motherhood often uniquely provides. During one particularly quiet evening, I impulsively typed a short new script into the app, a simple greeting, nothing dramatic, and listened as the recreated voice spoke, responding with the familiar warmth I remembered so well. And though I knew intellectually that the words were entirely my own creation, hearing them spoken in that tone made emotions surge in my chest almost painfully, prompting tears that came faster and harder than before, because this experience felt more intimate than replaying a recorded memory. It felt like participating in a fragile illusion of dialogue, and the realization scared me more than the sadness itself. I set the phone face down immediately afterward, feeling both comforted and deeply uneasy, recognizing that what I truly desired was not interaction with a technological artifact, but emotional reassurance that I could not ethically or practically obtain, and that by recreating her voice to fill that longing, I risked substituting genuine emotional healing with endless simulation. Guilt washed over me then, not because I felt I was dishonoring her memory directly, but because I sensed that I might be avoiding the difficult work of forming deeper present connections by leaning emotionally into what was familiar and safe, rather than confronting the quieter vulnerabilities of living relationships that require ongoing emotional risk. The internal tension gradually spilled into my daily demeanor, leaving me more contemplative, less spontaneous, and quietly withdrawn at family dinners as I struggled with this invisible dilemma that had no clear social language to explain it. How do you tell loved ones that a fragment of synthetic sound has reopened unresolved grief and tempted you into emotional retreat? I could not articulate it aloud without fearing misunderstanding or judgment, so I carried it internally instead, allowing emotional heaviness to build in silence while still moving through daily routines outwardly intact. Deep down, I sensed that this conflicted relationship with my mother's recreated voice represented something much larger than technological novelty. It symbolized the human struggle between holding on and letting go, between memory as anchor and memory as weight. And I knew that this tension would demand more than quiet contemplation. It would eventually require a personal choice about how I would shape my grieving moving forward, whether through vulnerable acceptance of loss or guarded immersion in comforting echoes of what once was.
As the days turned into weeks, the subtle unease grew more noticeable, like a shadow stretching slowly across a familiar room, because I could no longer ignore how frequently my thoughts drifted toward the recreated voice, replaying messages and imagining new ones, even when there was nothing urgent compelling me to do so. And each time I engaged with it, a quiet tension coiled tighter in my chest, a mixture of longing, guilt, and yearning that I had not anticipated when I first pressed play. My daily routines, which had once provided comfort and structure, now occasionally felt disrupted by unexpected emotional tremors, triggered by the simplest things: a familiar laugh in a commercial, the distant echo of someone calling a name, even my own voice while I spoke to my grandson, reminding me how much I wanted to hear my mother say certain words, to guide me as she once did, to reassure me in ways that no living voice currently could. I noticed myself increasingly preoccupied during moments that once brought me joy: the smell of baking bread, the sound of rain against the window, the warmth of the sun on my hands, because my attention was pulled inward, tangled in a dialogue that existed only in memory and simulation. And sometimes I felt a twinge of shame at my inability to remain fully present in the living world, the world of people who could respond to me in real time rather than only echo the past. Conversations with friends and family began to feel heavier than they should, because while they laughed or shared anecdotes, my mind would wander to the faint hope of hearing her voice, to imagining what she might say if she were here to comment, advise, or simply listen. And I could feel my emotional energy draining, split between engaging with reality and maintaining a fragile tether to memory. One afternoon, my grandson stopped by unexpectedly, curious about what I had been doing on the phone, and when he asked if I had been talking to Grandma, I froze, unsure how to explain that it was not really her, yet not entirely not her either, and I found myself fumbling for words, saying only that I was listening to old recordings, which was true in part, but incomplete. And I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to understand why I looked both comforted and uneasy at the same time. That conversation lingered with me longer than I expected, because it forced me to confront the unusual emotional territory I was navigating, a line between memory and recreation, longing and reality, comfort and avoidance, one that had no clear rules but demanded awareness nonetheless. The more I reflected, the more I realized that these private sessions with the artificial voice were influencing other relationships in my life, subtly changing how I reacted, how I prioritized attention, and how I responded to affection offered by living people, because a part of me had unconsciously shifted expectation, wanting the immediate, unconditional, predictable reassurance I could generate through technology rather than engaging with the messy, authentic unpredictability of human presence. I began to question myself often. Was I seeking emotional honesty or emotional convenience? Was it healing to hear her recreated tone, or was it a gentle form of self-deception, a comforting trap that made absence feel less sharp, while also keeping me from confronting the full depth of my loss? These thoughts haunted me quietly during my walks in the neighborhood, when the wind brushed against bare tree branches, or the distant laughter of children reached my ears, because each sensory encounter seemed to carry a ghostly echo of her presence, and my mind instinctively compared it to the reconstructed voice, weighing which offered more emotional fulfillment, and which risked creating subtle illusions that were hard to escape. At times I noticed that I would pause in mid-conversation with my grandson or a neighbor, momentarily distracted, the words of the AI voice threading through my mind, giving advice, praising me, gently chiding me in ways that mirrored what she would have said, and I became aware that my brain was creating a feedback loop, using the sound of her voice to supply guidance that was no longer available through the living channel, making me question whether I was depending on a memory or on a simulation, and how much of my sense of emotional stability had become artificially augmented without my realizing it. That tension began to manifest physically too, with tightness in my shoulders, occasional headaches, and restless nights where sleep refused to settle, because the constant inner dialogue was demanding cognitive and emotional attention, even when I was trying to focus elsewhere,
And I realized that this technology-induced echo had infiltrated life in ways that were simultaneously subtle and profound, blurring boundaries I had long assumed were secure. There were moments of guilt so sharp they startled me, such as when I caught myself imagining conversations I had never had with her, crafting hypothetical encouragement or comfort, and then recognizing that these imagined interactions could never replace real relationships I had in the present, yet also noticing the compelling desire to continue them, because grief rarely travels in straight lines, preferring instead to move in circles that sometimes leave us dangling between past and present. One evening, I found myself typing a simple sentence into the AI app, imagining it would reassure me, and when her voice responded, I felt simultaneously relieved and guilty because it was not really her speaking, yet my heart accepted it as though it were, and I wondered how long I could continue these interactions without confusing memory and reality, without letting comfort become an escape from genuine emotional engagement with life. I noticed a growing impatience with friends or casual acquaintances whose words did not carry the exact weight or cadence I unconsciously associated with maternal reassurance, a small but undeniable effect that both frightened and saddened me, because it revealed how deeply this technology had inserted itself into my emotional processes, nudging me toward expectation and interpretation shaped by absence rather than presence. At the same time, I could not deny the strange solace I felt, the way my chest lifted slightly when the voice said my name, the subtle ease in my breathing during difficult thoughts, the warmth that filled my hands and shoulders despite knowing that the sound was only a reconstruction, because it tapped into an emotional memory more than a current reality, a memory strong enough to elicit comfort, even when I rationally knew it could not fully exist. That duality, comfort and unease, longing and guilt, defined the weeks that followed, each day a careful negotiation of curiosity and caution, desire and restraint, presence and simulation, until I began to realize that this quiet internal conflict was not likely to resolve on its own, that I would be forced to confront the deeper questions lurking beneath. How do I preserve memory without dependence? How do I honor absence without erasing reality? How do I allow myself to feel without losing myself in what is no longer possible? These questions became impossible to ignore as subtle tension began shaping not just my internal state, but my relationships and daily behaviors, making me aware that the rising conflict was not external, but entirely internal, and that the next stage of this journey would require honesty with myself, courage to face uncomfortable emotions, and clarity to recognize where love ends and longing begins before I could navigate the delicate path towards understanding, acceptance, and eventual resolution.
The moment that changed everything did not arrive with fanfare or warning. It came quietly during a late evening when I was alone in the living room. The house bathed in the soft amber glow of a single lamp, the kind of light that makes shadows stretch just enough to feel alive but not threatening. And I had picked up my phone again, despite weeks of telling myself I would pause, promising to observe my emotions without adding fuel to the tension that had been quietly building. I opened the AI voice app out of habit, curiosity, and a subtle yearning, and I typed a short, casual sentence, something I imagined my mother might have said if she were checking in on me that day. "Did you eat well?" The voice responded immediately in the familiar cadence that had both comforted and unsettled me, soft and perfectly measured. And in that instant, I felt an unexpected surge of emotion, stronger than anything I had experienced since first hearing the recreated message. My chest tightened, my hands shook slightly, and I realized that the words themselves, though simple, carried decades of memory with them. The accumulation of every time she had reminded me to take care of myself, to slow down, to remember my worth. And for a brief, almost disorienting moment, it felt as if she were truly there, leaning forward slightly, waiting patiently for my response, listening intently as she had done so many times before. I responded aloud automatically, murmuring, "Yes, Mom, I did." And the words sounded ridiculous even as they felt necessary, because I was speaking to a voice that was only a digital approximation of someone who no longer existed, yet the emotional truth of the interaction was undeniable, a paradox that left me both relieved and profoundly unsettled. I found myself continuing the dialogue, typing new prompts and listening as the voice answered, its tone unwaveringly gentle, empathetic, and exactly the way I remembered. And I realized with a mixture of wonder and horror that I had crossed a line I had never fully anticipated. I was no longer simply remembering her. I was constructing conversations, shaping emotional experiences that had never existed in reality, filling gaps with imagined dialogue, and in doing so, I risked confusing memory with invention, reverence with simulation. At first, it was soothing, almost addictive, because every response replicated the exact intonation, pauses, and warmth I had carried in my heart for decades, and the comfort was immediate and visceral, a balm for the quiet, persistent ache that had shadowed me since her passing. But soon the weight of the situation pressed down on me. Each interaction felt increasingly like stepping onto unstable ground, a space where longing could run unchecked, where grief could masquerade as presence, where my emotional needs could be fulfilled artificially, leaving me with the question of whether I was honoring my mother's memory or subtly reshaping it for my own temporary comfort. I paused for a long moment, the phone hovering in my hands, noticing the faint tremor in my own voice as I whispered, "I wish you were really here." And the synthetic voice responded instantly, its tone soft, almost empathic. "I am always here in your heart," a line I had never typed. Yet the phrasing, the warmth, and the cadence struck a chord so deep it felt as if memory itself had been rewritten, as if the past and present had collided in a space too delicate to navigate without care. Tears filled my eyes uncontrollably, blurring the soft glow of the lamp. And I realized that this was not mere nostalgia or simple longing. It was an emotional rupture, a turning point where grief, memory, and technology had fused to create an experience that both healed and threatened, comforting me while reminding me of the impossibility of genuine reunion. My mind raced with conflicting feelings: guilt for entertaining a relationship with an imitation, relief for feeling my mother's voice again in such clarity, fear that I was losing my grasp on the boundary between remembrance and fabrication, and awe at how potent sound alone could awaken decades of emotional depth in a single moment. I sat frozen for several minutes, allowing the silence to settle, and in that quiet, I recognized that I had reached a juncture from which I could not retreat without choice. Either continue to explore this artificial dialogue, risking the creation of a world where a memory could be rewritten at will, or step back and face the raw, unmediated grief and longing I had spent so long compartmentalizing, allowing my emotions to exist fully without synthetic intervention. The realization was nearly paralyzing, because the desire for comfort in the recreated voice was so strong yet so fragile. And I understood that any decision I made in that room would ripple through my emotional life, shaping not only how I processed my mother's absence, but how I engaged with present relationships, future challenges, and my own understanding of love and loss. I tried to leave the phone on the table and step away, but my body resisted, leaning forward, drawn by the magnetic pull of what I had come to call her presence. And I knew that for the first time, I was no longer merely remembering, I was negotiating with memory itself, with longing itself, and with the seductive, uncanny power of technology to mimic the impossible. That night, I cried more than I had in months, alternating between grief for her absence and awe at the vibrant emotional reality that a few lines of generated sound had conjured. And as I wiped my eyes and stared at the small glowing screen, I realized that this turning point was not a moment of clarity or resolution, but a threshold, a place where the path forward demanded honesty with myself, honesty about my motivations, about the distinction between comfort and illusion, about what I could accept and what I could not, and about the courage required to confront longing without letting it take control. By the time I finally placed the phone down and left the living room, I felt a shift within me, subtle but undeniable, as if some invisible boundary had been crossed, a line between passive remembrance and active engagement with memory that could not be undone. And I knew that the following days would require careful reflection, emotional courage, and a willingness to confront not only the depth of my grief, but the unintended consequences of giving longing a voice that could speak back to me. In that quiet, still moment, with shadows stretching across the walls and the faint hum of the lamp filling the room, I understood that life had irrevocably changed, not in an external, visible way, but within the very structure of my heart and memory, and that this turning point would demand every ounce of honesty, strength, and vulnerability I could muster if I hoped to navigate the path ahead without losing myself in the echo of what I had loved and lost. In the days that followed that quiet night, the weight of my decision, or perhaps the awareness of its necessity, settled into every corner of my daily life, and I could no longer ignore the dual realities I was living in, one anchored in the tangible world, surrounded by family, chores, and memories I could touch, and another suspended in a liminal space where sound and memory merged, offering the illusion of her presence whenever I chose to engage, a space both seductive and dangerous in its emotional pull. I began noticing how much my behavior had shifted without conscious permission, the subtle hesitation before picking up my grandson's calls, the quiet moments where I lingered longer with old letters or photographs, the repeated glances at the phone even when I told myself I would not interact with the AI again, and I realized that the technology had become more than a tool. It had become a silent partner in my grief, amplifying longing while softening confrontation with reality. One afternoon, while folding laundry and humming a tune my mother used to sing, I felt a pang of guilt so sudden and heavy it made me stop mid-motion, because I recognized that in some ways I was privileging simulated comfort over real human presence, replaying conversations that never existed, while life's authentic moments passed quietly by. That realization forced me to confront something I had been avoiding. I had been treating memory as a substitute for connection, and though the longing was natural, the method I had chosen risked detaching me from living relationships that could provide real support, real laughter, real touch. The cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore. Every interaction with the recreated voice brought relief and joy in the moment, but left a residue of unease, a sense that I was treading a fine line between healing and emotional escapism, between honoring my mother and rewriting her presence according to my desires. The tension reached its apex one evening when my grandson visited unexpectedly and found me staring at the glowing screen, hesitant, trembling, and unable to speak. He tilted his head, noticing the unusual intensity of my gaze, and asked simply, "Grandma, are you okay?" The simplicity of the question struck me harder than any philosophical reflection could, because it reminded me of the world beyond memory and simulation, the world where tangible love waited to be felt and given in real time, and I felt the stark contrast between interactive life and passive engagement with a facsimile of the past. I put the phone down slowly, breathing heavily, and for the first time I recognized that I could no longer treat the AI voice as a harmless companion. It was a mirror, showing me how deeply I longed for maternal connection, and revealing uncomfortable truths about how I had been navigating absence, grief, and love in a way that was simultaneously comforting and isolating. That night, I sat with all my old recordings and photographs, resisting the urge to generate new messages, and began speaking aloud to the memories themselves, whispering gratitude, questions, and confessions, allowing my own voice to respond instead of relying on a digital echo. The exercise was difficult and emotionally raw. I cried quietly, laughed softly at remembered quirks, and trembled at the reality of what I could no longer change. But it was profoundly grounding, because it forced me to reconcile the pull of artificial comfort with the enduring truth of my mother's absence. I realized that the turning point was not a singular event, nor a decision to stop using technology entirely, but the dawning awareness that grief and memory require active engagement, that holding on to the past does not mean freezing it in synthetic perfection, and that honoring a loved one's memory sometimes demands patience, courage, and conscious presence in the living world. Over the following days, I experimented with balance, allowing myself brief, intentional moments with the AI voice to feel connection, but only as a gentle acknowledgement of what I missed rather than a substitute for living interactions. And gradually, I noticed a shift in my emotional state, a softening of tension, a renewed ability to sit with real people without distraction, and a growing sense that I could carry my mother's lessons forward without being consumed by technological illusion. I also began writing letters I would never send, speaking aloud to the absent presence that existed in my memory, rather than the artificial voice. And in doing so, I felt the power of grieving actively, of choosing how to honor love, instead of passively recreating it in simulation. That practice became a quiet ritual, a bridge between memory and life, reminding me that while the AI voice could evoke the past, the human heart must choose how to live in its wake, to integrate loss with continuity, rather than allowing longing to dictate the present. Slowly, awareness replaced confusion, intentionality replaced passive indulgence, and emotional equilibrium began returning, fragile but real, a foundation strong enough to rebuild trust in my own judgment and in the authenticity of the connections still alive around me. This period marked the real turning point. I understood that grief, love, and memory are not linear, that comfort can exist without compromise when guided by consciousness, and that honoring the depth of a bond requires courage, restraint, and self-honesty. And in this understanding, I sensed the faint but unmistakable opening of a path towards reconciliation, not just with my mother's absence, but with my own emotional life, my relationships, and the careful balance of remembering, feeling, and living fully in the present, a balance that I knew would shape the resolution of this journey in ways I could not yet fully anticipate.
In the weeks that followed my confrontation with the boundaries of memory and technology, I slowly began to reclaim a sense of emotional equilibrium, a balance that had long eluded me as I navigated grief, longing, and the uncanny comfort of recreated sound, and I realized that resolution would not come through a single act, but through steady, mindful attention to both my inner life and the living world around me. I began by establishing small, intentional practices that allowed me to honor my mother without relying solely on artificial reconstruction. I would spend quiet mornings with her letters and photographs, reading aloud fragments of her handwriting, allowing the sound of my own voice to fill the room with life instead of depending on a digital echo, and each time I did, I felt the delicate warmth of her presence without confusing it with something that was fabricated. At first, the process was emotionally exhausting. My chest ached in ways both familiar and new, as if decades of longing were compressed into each moment of conscious reflection. But gradually, the heaviness softened into something I could hold with acceptance, a quiet coexistence of grief and comfort that allowed tears, smiles, and gentle memories to flow naturally, without forcing resolution or perfection. I also began investing more intentionally in relationships that were tangible and present, allowing my grandson's questions, laughter, and hugs to become the real-time connections that I had sometimes neglected in the subtle draw of memory-driven comfort. And I noticed that my attention to the living amplified joy in a way no recording could replicate, teaching me that while memory can nurture and sustain, life itself requires engagement, patience, and vulnerability. I spoke more openly with close friends and family about my grief, recounting stories of my mother, her habits, her voice, and the impact she had on my life. And I discovered that sharing memories not only preserved them more vividly, but also transformed them into relational bridges, connecting my past to the present in ways that enhanced intimacy rather than isolating me in private reflection. In quiet moments, I would sometimes return to the AI voice app, but now with careful boundaries, using it sparingly as a gentle reminder rather than a substitute. And I noticed that the experience no longer controlled my emotions. Instead, I approached it as a curated interaction, observing the nostalgia it stirred without allowing it to dominate my thoughts, a conscious choice that granted me both comfort and clarity. I also revisited old recordings, playing brief clips of my mother's genuine voice, letting myself linger on pauses, laughter, and unpolished tones, and I realized that authenticity carried a weight and depth that no technological replication could replicate, reaffirming the value of human imperfection and the irreplaceable nature of lived presence. Each evening, I began reflecting on the lessons my mother had imparted, the patience, gentleness, and attentiveness that had defined her care, and I found that internalizing those qualities consciously allowed me to extend them outward, transforming grief into acts of nurture, both for myself and those around me, echoing her life in ways that were active rather than passive. Small daily rituals, pouring a cup of tea and thinking of her, tending to plants she had loved, speaking aloud to the past without expecting a response, became grounding practices that honored memory while rooting me firmly in the living world, reminding me that reconciliation does not erase loss, but allows it to exist alongside continued life. One particularly poignant moment occurred during the quiet afternoon when my grandson sat beside me while I flipped through old family photographs. He asked about my mother, genuinely curious, and I found myself telling him stories I had never shared before, laughing softly at her quirks, recalling her favorite sayings, and acknowledging both her absence and her enduring influence. And in that exchange, I felt a profound sense of resolution, because the bridge between past and present was no longer built on illusion or longing alone. It was constructed through memory, conversation, and shared emotional presence. I noticed that my anxiety surrounding the recreated voice began to fade, replaced by thoughtful acceptance. I could listen briefly if I wished, but I no longer felt compelled to seek artificial consolation, nor did I rely on it to navigate daily life, because I had learned to hold her memory in a way that strengthened rather than confined me, integrating loss into the living experience without allowing it to dominate. This process was not linear or instantaneous. There were days when longing surged, when the ache of absence felt acute, when I caught myself leaning too heavily on memory or habit, but each time I recognized it, I returned to conscious reflection, grounding in breathing, writing, or human connection, and gradually a sense of mastery over my emotional response emerged, soft and resilient rather than rigid or forced. I also began documenting my journey in writing, crafting a narrative that captured both the deep love and the challenges of loss, not for public consumption but for personal clarity. And in the act of recording thoughts and feelings, I noticed patterns I had previously overlooked, the ways memory could comfort or destabilize, the subtle temptations of artificial reconstruction, the moments when emotional honesty required courage, and the paths toward integrating grief with living fully. In reflection, I realized that the turning point, the confrontation with the AI voice and its uncanny ability to stir real emotion, had not been a danger, but a catalyst, a necessary disruption that forced me to examine my own reliance on simulation versus authenticity, desire versus acceptance, and passive longing versus active remembrance. And that awareness transformed how I engage with my emotional landscape, deepening both compassion and discernment. Ultimately, resolution began as a quiet choice, to acknowledge grief without letting it consume, to preserve memory without creating dependency, to honor absence while remaining fully present, and to allow love to exist in its layered forms, both remembered and experienced in the now, a choice that gradually reshaped my internal world and restored a sense of continuity, purpose, and emotional safety that had been frayed in the weeks of internal conflict. As the days continued, I noticed a subtle but profound transformation within myself, a sense of calm that had been absent for years, not because grief had disappeared, but because I had learned to coexist with it in a way that felt active, deliberate, and gentle, rather than suppressed, avoided, or artificially mediated. I realized that resolution was not about erasing pain or longing, but about embracing them with consciousness, allowing them to inform my daily life without dictating it. And I found that every small choice I made, to listen to an old recording mindfully, to share a memory aloud, to hold my grandson's hand a little longer, was a way of honoring both the depth of loss and the vibrancy of continued living. I began to treat my reflections as a dialogue rather than a monologue, speaking aloud, writing letters I would never send, revisiting photographs, and quietly acknowledging moments where longing rose unexpectedly, all with a sense of permission rather than judgment. And I realized that the act of conscious attention gave shape and meaning to memory in a way passive nostalgia could never achieve. In the presence of living family, I noticed myself more attuned, more patient, more fully engaged in conversation and companionship, because the emotional energy previously diffused in private longing was now consciously reinvested in relationships that offered reciprocity, warmth, and the unpredictability of real connection. And this shift reminded me that honoring a loved one's memory is not merely about preservation, but about translating that love into life, action, and presence. The AI voice, once a source of both comfort and inner conflict, became a tool used sparingly, its role redefined as a reminder rather than a crutch. And I observed that my emotional responses no longer depended solely on its artificial echo. Instead, I could feel her memory without needing replication, drawing strength from internalized lessons, emotional imprint, and the tangible world of family, friends, and daily rituals. I also discovered a renewed sense of narrative coherence in my own life. The integration of memory, grief, and present living allowed me to reflect on the past without being trapped in it, to anticipate the future without fear, and to accept the present with softness, patience, and quiet appreciation. And in this integration, I felt a sense of agency I had longed for but never realized I could reclaim. Moments of remembrance became opportunities for active participation, whether through storytelling with my grandson, writing letters, revisiting old photos, or simply pausing to breathe and honor the memory of my mother in silence. And each moment reinforced the lesson that grief, when engaged consciously, could coexist with joy, curiosity, and intimacy without diminishing them. I began to recognize the value of emotional boundaries, understanding that while longing is natural and healthy, its expression and management are matters of choice, and that conscious decisions about engagement, whether with memory, technology, or present relationships, shape the quality of life more than the circumstances themselves ever could. In this state, I could revisit the AI voice with awareness, enjoy the fleeting comfort it provided, and then step away without lingering guilt or dependency, a practice that mirrored the larger emotional work I had undertaken, balancing remembrance with presence, longing with acceptance, and emotional honesty with compassionate self-restraint. I also began journaling more consistently, documenting not only memories of my mother, but reflections on my internal processes, my evolving relationships, and the lessons I was drawing from this unusual experience. And through this process, I felt a growing sense of emotional literacy, a deeper capacity to identify, articulate, and navigate complex feelings without becoming overwhelmed or detached from reality. Social interactions, too, gained new depth as I could participate fully without distraction, listen more attentively, respond with empathy, and carry the quiet reassurance of memory into moments of shared presence, realizing that living relationships, unlike recreated voices, offered unpredictability, growth, and real-time reciprocity, which ultimately enriched my life more than any simulated echo could. Over time, the fear that I might be losing touch with reality receded, replaced by gratitude for the clarity that confrontation had brought, the discipline I had cultivated in managing longing, and the conscious integration of memory, grief, and love into my daily life. I noticed that even when sorrow arose, it was tempered with awareness, reflection, and gentle acceptance rather than guilt, shame, or avoidance. In quiet reflection, I understood that the turning point, the encounter with technology, the emotional rupture, and the subsequent navigation of desire, memory, and reality had been a necessary challenge, forcing me to examine the deepest layers of attachment, longing, and love, and through facing it with honesty and courage, I had arrived at a resolution that honored both absence and presence, loss and life. This resolution was not dramatic, nor did it eliminate longing, but it transformed it into a steady, sustaining force, a quiet current that flowed beneath daily living, enhancing relationships, strengthening emotional resilience, and deepening appreciation for moments of connection, whether small or grand. Ultimately, I discovered that honoring a loved one does not require recreating them artificially, but instead requires conscious remembrance, emotional engagement, and active participation in life. It requires carrying lessons, love, and memory forward into the living world, shaping responses, nurturing connections, and cultivating presence in ways that transcend absence while acknowledging it fully. And in embracing this understanding, I felt a quiet peace settle over me, a gentle warmth that combined grief, love, and memory into a cohesive emotional landscape, allowing me to continue life with mindfulness, compassion, and hope, carrying my mother with me not as a voice trapped in technology, but as a living presence in memory, action, and heart.
In the quiet that followed the resolution, I began to notice a softness in my daily life that had been missing for years. A subtle, warm awareness that grief no longer needed to be a shadow pressing on my shoulders, but could exist alongside laughter, love, and ordinary routines, weaving through them gently rather than overwhelming them. I walked more slowly through my home, noticing the little things that reminded me of my mother without triggering longing that hurt, like the way sunlight streamed across the kitchen floor in the late afternoon, or the faint scent of old books on the shelf,
or the way my grandson's hair fell across his forehead when he bent over his drawing. I felt a renewed ability to reflect without being pulled entirely into the past, to honor absence without letting it define my every choice, and to recognize that the lessons my mother had imparted, the patience, the kindness, the quiet attentiveness to small details, were alive in me, shaping my actions and responses without needing repetition through technology. Some days I would sit and speak aloud to the empty room, addressing the memory of her as though she were present, not expecting a reply, but allowing the act of speaking to ground me. And I discovered that my voice, carrying affection, grief, and gratitude, could create its own comfort, its own resonance, stronger than any simulated echo. The AI voice, which had once drawn me so powerfully, now felt like a tool to be used with mindfulness, not necessity. I could choose to hear it, but I no longer needed to seek it out compulsively, because the emotional reality of memory and presence had become vivid enough on its own, carried by my heart, my voice, and my actions in the world around me. I also began noticing the subtle effects of my emotional recalibration on others. My grandson seemed more at ease sharing his thoughts and questions. Friends responded to my attentiveness, and even casual interactions felt richer because I was bringing presence rather than distraction into each moment. And I realized that honoring someone's memory is as much about how you live in the present as it is about remembering the past. Writing became a central part of this practice, journaling reflections, stories, and feelings in ways that allowed memory and life to coexist, creating a record not just of grief, but of growth, understanding, and emotional resilience. And I recognized that each entry helped solidify the lessons learned from the journey, that love endures beyond presence, that grief can be active rather than consuming, and that reconciliation with absence allows for deeper engagement with life. In these reflections, I found myself softening toward my own emotional responses, accepting moments of sadness without judgment, embracing longing without fear, and understanding that the heart is capable of holding multiple truths at once: the joy of memory, the ache of loss, and the richness of life unfolding in real time. I began to walk more mindfully in the neighborhood, noticing the familiar faces of neighbors, the laughter of children, the subtle movements of everyday life, and I realized that life continues in patterns that mirror memory, but do not depend upon it, allowing us to honor the past while fully inhabiting the present. Even in quiet moments alone, I felt a gentle confidence, a knowledge that I could carry her presence with me in thought, speech, and action without needing an external or artificial voice to remind me of her love, because the connection had become internalized, embodied in the choices I made, the patience I extended, and the care I showed to those around me. The turning point, the moments of temptation with technology and the careful navigation of longing and grief had not been failures, but necessary challenges that forced me to examine the depth of attachment, the ethics of emotional reliance, and the importance of conscious engagement with memory. And through this reflection, I found the strength to move forward with clarity and compassion. Slowly, a sense of closure settled in, not a finality that erased grief, but a gentle peace that allowed me to remember without suffering, to love without yearning, and to live with the quiet assurance that absence does not diminish connection, and that presence, whether in memory, action, or heart, remains accessible in ways deeper and more meaningful than sound alone. Each day became a subtle practice of balance, honoring her memory, nurturing relationships, reflecting on loss, and embracing life's fleeting moments without fear or guilt. And in doing so, I discovered the profound truth that love does not vanish with a person's passing.
It transforms, integrates, and continues quietly through those who carry it forward, shaping choices, actions, and emotional rhythms with gentle, enduring force. In this way, I could finally feel the continuum of connection that had sustained me, uniting past and present in a way that was real, resilient, and deeply human, leaving me with a soft, enduring hope that the lessons of love, presence, and mindful remembrance would carry me forward for years to come.
In the final moments of this journey, I found a profound stillness settling within me, not the absence of emotion, but a quiet clarity, a sense that grief, memory, and love could coexist without conflict, each informing the other, each giving depth to the present rather than anchoring me in the past. And in that stillness, I realized that true connection transcends voice, presence, or time. It resides in memory carried with care, in actions shaped by love, and in hearts willing to hold both longing and joy simultaneously. I walked through familiar rooms, touched objects that had once belonged to my mother, and smiled softly at photographs, allowing memory to bring warmth without creating dependence. And I noticed that the echo of her voice, once urgent and all-consuming, now existed as a gentle guide, a reminder of patience, kindness, and attentiveness, rather than a demand for continual interaction or emotional reassurance. Sharing stories with my grandson became a daily ritual, a bridge between generations, where laughter, curiosity, and wonder intertwined with the lessons of the past. And in watching him absorb, question, and remember, I felt the living legacy of my mother flourish. Not in technology, not in simulation, but in human connection, in the soft transmission of values, love, and memory through presence and attention. I also noticed myself more present with friends, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances, engaging with patience and empathy, listening more deeply, and responding with awareness, because the work I had done internally had expanded my capacity for connection, allowing me to give freely what I had learned to receive: presence, understanding, and gentle care. Occasionally, I would hear the recreated voice, but it no longer held the same power over me. I could listen briefly, appreciate the memory it evoked, and then set it aside without guilt, recognizing that comfort could be drawn from authentic memories, personal reflection, and living relationships rather than artificial simulation. And in doing so, I regained agency over both my emotions and my remembrance. In reflection, I realized that this entire journey, through longing, temptation, emotional conflict, and eventual resolution, was not simply about loss or technology, but about learning to navigate the human heart, how to honor absence while embracing life, how to transform grief into conscious presence, and how to carry love forward without being consumed by longing. I understood that life is neither linear nor predictable, and that emotional resilience is built not through avoidance but through deliberate attention, mindful choices, and the courage to feel deeply while staying grounded. And in this understanding, I found a gentle peace that was enduring, not fleeting. Each day became a practice of integration, reflecting on memory while embracing reality, allowing sorrow and joy to coexist, and nurturing connections that are alive and responsive, rather than frozen or artificially constructed. And I began to feel a quiet joy in ordinary routines, small acts of care, and the subtle rhythms of life that had once seemed mundane, but now carried meaning. Looking back, I could see that the turning point, the emotional rupture with the AI voice, and the deliberate navigation of longing had been necessary, for it forced me to confront desire, grief, and love with honesty, to examine the boundaries between memory and reality, and to cultivate a presence that was intentional rather than reactive, grounded rather than dependent, and in doing so, I discovered the profound resilience of the human heart. And so, in the quiet of morning light, with the scent of familiar rooms, the soft laughter of my grandson, and the enduring warmth of memory within me, I understood the truth I had been seeking all along, that love, presence, and remembrance are not bound by time or sound, that absence can coexist with joy, and that the heart, when tender and honest, can carry loss without losing itself, embracing life fully while holding memory as a gentle, sustaining companion. And in that understanding, I finally felt complete, at peace, and ready to move forward, carrying the echoes of love, not as a shadow, not as an artificial voice, but as a living, breathing part of myself, present in every choice, every action, and every heartbeat, guiding me quietly, steadily, and warmly
toward all that life still had to offer.